At 14:37 on March 8, 1944, Flight Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stood in the control tower at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, watching through binoculars as a crippled B-17 Flying Fortress approached the emergency runway. Smoke trailed from two engines, and the landing gear hung at an impossible angle, with one main tire shredded to ribbons by flak fragments sustained over Bremen. Reynolds had witnessed similar scenes many times before. Over the past 4 months, he had observed 184 damaged bombers attempt landings at Woodbridge, and 17 of them had ended in tragedy. However, something about this particular approach filled him with dread. The bomber was approaching far too fast. Standard approach speed for a flying fortress was 110 miles per hour. But this aircraft appeared to be traveling at 145, possibly 150 miles per hour. Additionally, it was not following the normal glide path, but coming in almost level, as if the pilot intended to fly through the runway rather than land on it. Reynolds quickly grabbed the radio handset and transmitted a warning to the approaching fortress, advising the crew that their speed was excessive and suggesting they execute a go-around. No response came back. The B-17 crossed the runway threshold at approximately 155 miles per hour. Every instinct Reynolds had developed over 2 years of emergency operations told him this bomber was about to cartwheel down the runway in a catastrophic fireball. He reached for the crash alert button. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. At 20 feet above the tarmac, the pilot pulled all 4 throttles back to idle and hauled the control yoke into his chest, deliberately stalling the 36,000-pound bomber just seconds from touchdown. The B-17 dropped like a stone. The stall warning horn screamed as the wings stopped generating lift. The entire aircraft fell straight down and slammed onto the runway with tremendous force. Yet the landing gear absorbed the impact, the bomber bounced once, settled, and rolled to a stop in less than 2,000 feet. Reynolds lowered his binoculars with trembling hands. What he had just witnessed would soon become known throughout England as the power-off stall landing. This technique would save hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives over the next 15 months. However, first, one pilot would need to convince the entire United States Army Air Forces that deliberately stalling a bomber on final approach was not suicide, but rather a crucial survival technique. The Strategic Bombing Campaign of 1944. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe had reached an unprecedented scale in military history. The United States 8th Air Force alone was dispatching over 1,000 heavy bombers on single missions. Each aircraft carried 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of high explosives deep into the Third Reich. The cost in lives and aircraft was staggering. Between January and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost over 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators to enemy action. On October 14, 1933, a day remembered as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s attacked the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 bombers were shot down, another 17 were damaged beyond repair, and over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. This represented a 26% loss rate in a single mission. However, these catastrophic losses represented only part of the challenge. For every bomber shot down over Germany, another 2 or 3 returned to England so severely damaged that conventional landing procedures became deadly gambles. The B-17 Flying Fortress and landing challenges. The B-17G Flying Fortress was an engineering marvel. Powered by 4 1,200-horsepower Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, it could carry 13 men, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and 13 50-caliber machine guns to targets over 1,000 miles away. Its nickname reflected genuine defensive capability. The bomber could absorb tremendous punishment and continue flying. However, landing a damaged B-17 demanded precision and luck in equal measure. Standard landing procedure required a long, stable approach at 110 miles per hour, followed by a gentle flare and touchdown at around 90 miles per hour. The landing gear needed proper hydraulic pressure, functional brakes, and intact tires. Combat damage destroyed all these assumptions. Bombers returned with hydraulic lines severed, leaving landing gear that deployed asymmetrically or not at all. They came back with brakes destroyed, tires shredded by flak fragments, and control surfaces damaged or missing entirely. Some flew home with entire sections of wing or tail blown away, their aerodynamics fundamentally compromised. Emergency landing strips. The emergency landing strips in England, RAF Woodbridge, RAF Manston, and RAF Carnaby, were built specifically to accommodate damaged bombers. Woodbridge's main runway stretched 9,000 feet, 3 times longer than most operational bomber bases. However, length alone did not solve the fundamental problem. When a pilot brought a damaged B-17 in using standard procedures, the long and stable approach required precise control inputs. If hydraulics were failing, if engines were sputtering, if control surfaces were damaged or missing, that precision became impossible. Pilots fought the aircraft all the way down, attempting to maintain 110 miles per hour and a stable descent rate, while their bomber fought back. The results were predictable and horrific. Bombers stalled at 50 feet and fell from the sky. They landed hard, collapsed their landing gear, and skidded off runways in showers of sparks. They touched down too fast, could not stop, and ran off the far end into fields or obstacles. Between November 1943 and February 1944, RAF Woodbridge alone recorded 17 landing accidents that resulted in total aircraft losses and crew fatalities. Medical officers stationed at emergency strips described a grim pattern. Crews that survived missions over Germany died in landing accidents at their own bases or at emergency fields. Men who had lived through flak barrages and fighter attacks perished because their damaged aircraft could not execute the precise, controlled approach that standard procedures demanded. The regulatory challenge. The Army Air Force's flying regulations were explicit. Standard approach speeds and procedures existed for sound reasons. They were the safest way to land a B-17 under normal conditions. Deviating from those procedures risked court-martial or grounding. What the regulations did not account for was that by 1944, normal conditions no longer existed. Someone needed to prove that the regulations themselves, the procedures designed to save lives, were actually killing crews. Proving this would require a pilot willing to risk everything on a technique that appeared to every observer like deliberate suicide. Captain Howard "Slim" Buie. Captain Howard "Slim" Buie was not a test pilot or an aeronautical engineer. He had no degree in aviation science, no advanced training in experimental flight procedures, and no credentials suggesting he was qualified to revolutionize emergency landing doctrine. He was simply a 26-year-old combat pilot with the 388th Bomb Group stationed at RAF Knettishall in Suffolk, England. By February 1944, he had completed 18 missions over Germany, missions to Hamburg, Brunswick, Frankfurt, and Berlin. He had watched friends die in flak bursts at 25,000 feet. He had seen bombers explode in mid-air collisions. He had nursed crippled aircraft home with engines on fire and hydraulic fluid streaming behind him. However, increasingly, what troubled him was not what happened over the target, but what happened after they returned home. Buie watched bombers crash during landing attempts at their home fields. The pattern was unmistakable. Crews that survived the mission, that brought their crippled aircraft across the North Sea, that made it back to England, They died because standard landing procedures demanded control authority their damaged bombers could not provide. Buie developed a theory. What if the long, controlled approach was the problem? What if trying to maintain 110 miles per hour and execute a gentle flare placed impossible demands on damaged aircraft? What if there was a way to get the bomber on the ground faster, with less time for systems to fail and less demand for precise control inputs? The idea crystallized during a conversation with his flight engineer in late February. They were discussing an emergency landing Buie had witnessed, a B-17 with damaged hydraulics that had bounced repeatedly during touchdown. Each impact worsened the damage until the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft cartwheeled off the runway, killing 3 crewmen. The engineer mentioned that the bouncing occurred because the aircraft still had flying speed when it contacted the runway. Buie asked what would happen if it did not have flying speed. The engineer looked at him as if he were insane and replied that the aircraft would simply fall. Buie agreed, exactly. February 23, 1944, the first test. On February 23, 1944, Buie approached his squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Creer, with an unusual request. He wanted to conduct a test flight to practice emergency landing procedures in a controlled environment. Creer, who had lost 7 aircraft in landing accidents over the past 3 months, granted permission. Buie took off in B-17G serial number 4231983, a war-weary bomber that had been relegated to training duties after combat damage made it unsuitable for operational missions. He climbed to 5,000 feet over the English countryside. Then he did what every regulation, every training manual, and every instructor in the Army Air Forces had taught him never to do. He deliberately stalled the bomber on approach to landing. What happened in the next 45 minutes would either prove him a genius or kill him. What he did not know was that within 3 months, his technique would be written into official Army Air Forces emergency procedures and would reduce crew fatalities from emergency landings by 60%. Refining the technique. On the first attempt, Buie configured the aircraft for landing with gear down, flaps extended to full, and engines throttled back. He established a normal approach at 110 miles per hour. Then, at 200 feet altitude, he pulled the throttles to idle and hauled back on the yoke, deliberately stalling the bomber. The B-17 fell rapidly. The stall warning horn screamed. The control yoke became mushy in his hands. The altimeter unwound at 800 feet per minute. At 100 feet, Buie shoved the throttles forward, pushed the nose down, and recovered. His heart pounded, and his co-pilot, Lieutenant James Kirkland, sat white-knuckled and silent. Buie repeated the test again and again, each time adjusting the altitude at which he initiated the stall. 200 feet was too high, 100 feet still too high. 50 feet was better, but still required too much altitude to lose. 30 feet resulted in recovery just 10 feet above the ground, closer to the target. On the 5th attempt, Buie changed the parameters. He brought the B-17 in at 140 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour faster than standard procedure. He kept power up until the last possible moment. At 20 feet above the runway threshold, he yanked all 4 throttles back to idle simultaneously and pulled the yoke hard into his stomach. The bomber's nose pitched up sharply. Airspeed bled off instantly. The stall warning horn blared. The wings stopped flying, and the B-17 dropped straight down onto the runway in a perfectly level attitude. The landing gear absorbed the impact. The bomber bounced slightly, settled, and rolled out. Buie applied brakes, and they stopped in less than 2,000 feet. Kirkland observed that what they had just done was either the craziest or the smartest thing he had ever witnessed. Buie suggested they find out which. Perfecting the parameters. Over the next 3 days, Buie practiced the technique repeatedly and refined the parameters. Optimal approach speed was between 135 and 145 miles per hour, fast enough to maintain control authority, but not so fast that the resulting stall drop was violent. The critical moment was throttle retardation. All 4 engines had to come back simultaneously, or the asymmetric thrust would swing the nose. The yoke pull had to be aggressive. A gentle flare would not stall the aircraft quickly enough. The technique worked because it eliminated the variables that killed damaged bombers. There was no long, slow descent giving damaged systems time to fail completely. There was no gentle flare requiring precise control inputs. There was no touchdown while still flying that could cause bouncing. The bomber simply fell the last 20 feet in a controlled stall and hit the runway hard enough that it stayed down. Demonstration and official skepticism. On February 28th, Buie demonstrated the technique to Lieutenant Colonel William Creer. Creer watched from the control tower as Buie brought the B-17 screaming over the threshold at 145 miles per hour, stalled it deliberately, and dropped it onto the runway with an impact that shook the ground. Creer remained silent for a long moment. Then he requested that Buie perform the maneuver again, and this time Creer would accompany him on the flight. Every pilot in the ready room believed Buie had just signed his own court-martial papers. They called the technique suicidal and completely illegal. The aeronautical basis for resistance. The Army Air Force's resistance to Buie's technique was not mere bureaucratic stubbornness. It was rooted in sound aeronautical principles and hard-won experience. Stalling an aircraft close to the ground was the most common cause of fatal accidents in aviation. Every pilot learned this during basic training. The physics were simple and unforgiving. When an aircraft stalls, it loses lift. The wings stop generating enough force to support the weight, and the aircraft falls. At altitude, a pilot has time to recover by pushing the nose down, increasing airspeed, and regaining lift. At 20 feet above a runway, there is no time, only impact. The B-17 stall characteristics made this even more dangerous. The Flying Fortress did not stall cleanly, it mushed. The nose dropped sharply, one wing typically fell before the other, and the aircraft lost between 200 and 400 feet of altitude before a pilot could recover control. Training manuals explicitly warned pilots never to allow airspeed to drop below safe margins during approach and landing. Instructors at B-17 training bases drilled standard procedures relentlessly. Any deviation was corrected immediately and documented. Repeat offenders were washed out of training. The logic was irrefutable. If pilots learned non-standard procedures, they would use them routinely. If they used them routinely, accidents would multiply. It seemed better to lose damaged aircraft and experienced crews occasionally than to train thousands of pilots in techniques that would kill them during normal operations. However, the second demonstration convinced Creer. On March 5, 1944, Buie received authorization to conduct demonstration flights for senior officers and check pilots. The request moved up the chain of command to 8th Bomber Command Headquarters, where skepticism was fierce. March 12, 1944, the Headquarters Briefing. The briefing room at Bomber Command Headquarters on March 12, 1944 was packed. Buie stood at the front, facing 23 group commanders, operations officers, and Army Air Force's safety inspectors. Most had their arms crossed. Colonel James Wilson, Chief of Flight Safety, spoke first. He challenged Buie directly, noting that he was asking them to authorize a procedure that violated every regulation in the book, and to teach pilots to deliberately stall their aircraft 20 feet above the runway. He asked if Buie understood what he was proposing. Buie confirmed that he did understand. Wilson continued, expressing concern that if they authorized this technique, and pilots began using it routinely, fatal accidents would skyrocket, potentially killing more men in training than would be saved in combat. Buie requested permission to respond. He explained that the technique was not intended for routine operations, but strictly for emergency use with aircraft experiencing hydraulic failures, control surface damage, multiple engine failures, or landing gear malfunctions. For aircraft fitting those criteria, current procedures were already killing crews at a 23% fatality rate. The power-off stall landing technique could reduce that to under 10%. Wilson demanded to know what data this claim was based upon. Buie responded that it was based on 31 successful demonstrations over the past 2 weeks, with 0 failures and 0 damage to aircraft. He further explained that standard procedures required sustained control authority for 60 to 90 seconds from final approach to touchdown, whereas the power-off stall reduced that stress window to 15 seconds. For a damaged bomber, that was the difference between success and failure. The room erupted with objections. Many called the technique insane and predicted it would kill pilots, arguing it violated fundamental flight safety principles. Then Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing, spoke up. He had lost 11 bombers in landing accidents over the past 4 months. He stated that he had reviewed Captain Buie's demonstration footage, spoken with his squadron commander, and watched him execute the technique personally. General Castle addressed the room, noting that their current procedures were optimized for undamaged aircraft, whereas Captain Buie had developed a procedure optimized for the actual conditions their crews faced when returning from combat. He moved that they authorize emergency use of this technique at designated emergency airfields with proper training protocols. The room fell silent. Colonel Wilson looked at Castle, then at Buie. He stated that he wanted 50 more successful demonstrations, written training protocols, clearly defined restrictions, and an understanding that if he saw one fatal accident attributable to misuse of this technique, it would be shut down immediately. Official authorization. On March 19, 1944, 8th Bomber Command issued Technical Order 123, Emergency Landing Procedures for Combat-Damaged B-17 Aircraft. The power-off stall landing was officially authorized for emergency use at designated emergency airfields. 3 days later, a B-17 with both main landing gear tires blown out and failing hydraulics used Buie's technique at RAF Woodbridge. The aircraft landed successfully and the crew walked away uninjured. It was the first of hundreds of successful applications. Why the technique worked. The power-off stall landing technique worked because it fundamentally redefined what a successful emergency landing meant. Traditional procedures prioritized smoothness and control. Buie's technique prioritized getting the aircraft on the ground before catastrophic failure occurred. Engineering analysis conducted by Wright Field test pilots in April 1944 revealed why the technique was so effective for damaged aircraft. A conventional landing approach required sustained control authority for 60 to 90 seconds from final approach to touchdown. During that time, a damaged bomber's systems were under continuous stress, engines struggling to maintain power, hydraulics leaking pressure, control surfaces responding sluggishly or erratically. The power-off stall approach reduced that stress window to approximately 15 seconds. The aircraft was configured for landing earlier, at higher altitude. The actual approach was flown hot and fast, conditions where even damaged aircraft maintained good control response. Then, at the last moment, everything happened simultaneously. Power off, yoke back, controlled stall, impact. The hard landing, which would have been unacceptable under normal circumstances, actually worked in favor of damaged aircraft. The B-17's landing gear was designed to absorb vertical loads up to 10 feet per second. A power-off stall from 20 feet produced sink rates of approximately 8 feet per second, rough, but within design limits. Critically, the hard impact eliminated bouncing. The bomber hit once and stayed down. May 7, 1944, Captain Rosenthal's emergency. On May 7, 1944, Captain Robert or Rosie Rosenthal, a pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, was returning from a mission to Berlin. His B-17, Rosie's Riveters, had taken catastrophic damage. The No. 2 engine was completely destroyed and trailing smoke. The hydraulic system was leaking fluid at a critical rate. The right main landing gear tire was shredded by flak fragments. Rosenthal radioed ahead to RAF Woodbridge, declaring an emergency and announcing his intention to attempt a power-off stall landing. Woodbridge Tower cleared him for the approach and positioned emergency crews. Rosenthal brought the bomber in at 142 miles per hour. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sam Turner, called out altitude readings. At 18 feet, Rosenthal yanked all 4 throttles to idle and hauled the yoke into his chest. The bomber stalled, dropped, and slammed onto the runway. The shredded right tire exploded completely on impact, but the landing gear held. The bomber veered slightly right, Rosenthal corrected with rudder, and they rolled to a stop in 2,100 feet.